Hi, I'm Patrick Reed of Depth of Field Magazine and Comics Alliance, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Hip Hop and Comics Cultures Combining. For as long as I can remember, I've loved hip hop and comics, all the different forms that they encompass, all the diversity that they represent. They're both uniquely American cultures and art forms. They're both cultures of inclusion, and they mix disparate elements, be it beats and rhymes, or words and pictures, or dance and graffiti, and science fiction and animation, and turntablism, and superheroes, and all sorts of things. There's so much in common between the two cultures once we start looking at it. Every single one of these conversations brings up some new odd connection that somehow I never thought of before, whether it's the common thrill of digging through old dusty records and old dusty comic books, or whether it's how both cultures have spawned now multi-million-dollar blockbusters in many different media. And both hip-hop and comics are cultures with long and diverse histories. Hip-hop springs from many other forms, from funk and poetry and spoken word and dance, and comics obviously come from comic strips and big little books, and going back as far as written visual communication. And both cultures continue to develop and evolve, incorporating new elements, creating something new wherever they go. Both cultures also inspire passionate fan bases, as you can tell if you go to any hip-hop show or any comic convention, like, say, this one. In that spirit, I'm really, really pleased to welcome this group that has gathered here today. Next to me, David Walker, author of the Shaft comic. Next, Emil Kanishi, illustrator, designer, and cartoonist. Matthew Rosenberg, well, I guess I usually say comic writer, but you're also now a comic PR guy for Black Mask, and a co-writer of Ghostface's last album. So, Matthew Rosenberg. Kenny Kyle, a cartoonist and illustrator extraordinaire. I'll get more into those specific credits in a little bit, because that's a whole other conversation. Kenny Kyle. And down the end, Ted Lange the Fourth and Turner Lange, two guys who I met at last year's WonderCon, wandering through Artist Alley. Walking through, I saw their stuff, I picked it up, and I was like, wow, you guys were like, hi, I'm Patrick, I did this hip hop panel. Their work totally took me by surprise, as actually Emil's did this year. And, I'm really pleased that they're here joining us again. So, Ted and Turner Lange. I guess I should also say up front that there's the giant elephant in the room, which is that both hip-hop and comics cultures are also cultures that traditionally have minimized and neglected women's contributions. And as ever, every time I do one of these panels, it ends up being overwhelmingly male, much like pretty much every panel that you'll see at a comic convention or every hip-hop show. And it's a sad reality. It's also something that, given the innate diversity and inclusion of both hip-hop and comics cultures, it needs to be addressed, it needs to be recognized, and it needs to continue to be worked. So, with that, let's talk about hip-hop and comics. I've obviously just rambled a bit about my personal experiences with them, but these two things, hip-hop and comics, what ties them together in your mind? What made you want to be a part of this panel discussion? And anyone can jump in first.
I'll start, sure. Okay. Well, for me, like hip hop, my definition of it is a lot more expansive than some people's. Because when a lot of people think hip hop, they think of primarily rap music. And for me, hip hop is the entire spectrum. So it's breakdancing, it's graffiti, it's turntablism, it's MCing. And so for me, the marriage between hip hop and comics, for me personally, started when I noticed the similarities between graffiti and there's an artist that I was really into when I was a kid, a cartoonist named Juan Baudet, who did a bunch of different stuff, Junk Waffle, Cheech Wizard, but he had done a book called Cobalt 60, a comic strip called Cobalt 60 that his son took over. And in the early 80s, they were reprinting it in a magazine called Epic Illustrated. And right around the same time, a book called Subway Art came out. And a lot of the graffiti artists, it was like really obvious that they were mimicking Juan Baudet's style. And there was a couple artists that, like, Howard the Duck was really popular in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was turning up in graffiti. And so, as a comic fan, I was really drawn into that visual aspect. And, like, to give you an idea of how old I am, you know, I remember when Rapper's Delight first dropped, and I remember when The Message first came out. So I was hearing all these songs for the first time and seeing breakdancers for the first time, but it was really that visual aspect that let me know that there were these people within the culture of hip hop, it wasn't even called hip hop back then actually, that were being influenced by the same things that I was, which was comics and cartoons.
I mean, for me personally, I got into doing like comics and illustration and stuff like that, just like putting out my own comic as kind of an answer to all the storytelling that I was seeing. And it wasn't really speaking to me personally. And so what I was trying to do was trying to mesh all these kind of different flavors into one book that I thought would kind of, that I felt represented more my sensibilities in storytelling, what I thought was lacking in storytelling, and taking those kind of elements of like hip hop culture, music, and black culture in general, and kind of packaging it for an audience in a way that is humorous and insightful. To try and change the kind of conversation, because I don't know, for me personally, I felt like I just wasn't seeing the kind of stories that I wanted to read, and I wasn't reading the kind of stories that I really liked. So for me personally, I was like, you know what, I'll put it out myself and do it on my own and just see what happens.
That is very hip hop. Selling it out of your drum combination.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, for me, it was just kind of it was the idea of, you know, because I mean, and you would see, like for me, I would read books or I would see stories and like they would get the beats wrong, or the characters would be out of sync, or the aspects of the story just didn't work. And for me, I was just like, you know what, I'll just do it myself, and try and open it up and showcase a kind of a different style of storytelling that people maybe hadn't seen before.
There's also, for me when I was growing up, there's a specific album, I think I must have been about like 12 or 13, and Digital Underground's This Is an EP release had everybody in the underground, like in these caricature sort of comic book style, like on the cover. And I was kind of like, oh, that's kind of cool. And it made them all almost like a super team or something, you know. And even to this day, I'm like, is Humpty Hump like Shock G? I don't know. Like, what's going on? Like, he has a secret identity? I don't know. But that like really crystallized.
Secret identity is like two identities.
Exactly. Yeah. And then actually, I don't know if you guys remember this in the 2000s. They said they had this whole thing where they said they were from the 30th century, Shock G and Humpty Hump. So I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, they went to the Hip Hop History Museum in the fucking, you know, excuse me, pardon me. In the 30th century, saw Digital Underground and like stole a time machine and came back and like created their whole catalog. And that's kind of cool. It's like Booster Gold or something.
Back with Deltron.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's another classic, Deltron 3030, which is like you can see it. You can see the comic when you listen to the album. It's like one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, anything that deals with creating these characters, telling stories, that was always my foothold for hip-hop and comics. That was just what I craved. And as far as like those early encounters, sort of like signs that there might be some overlap, I was thinking today about LL Cool J. There was a song on Bigger and Deffer which was like a tape I had that I played until it turned to dust. And there was this one track called "But My Rhyme Ain't Done," and it's just like, it's really bizarre, but like in the second or third verse, he's just kind of like stream of consciousness, making all these crazy pop culture references. And then like suddenly he started talking about like meeting Donald Duck and Spider-Man and starting a band with the Incredible Hulk. And just to be at that age and to hear that and just like, you kind of just, your eyes light up, you immediately picture that image, and suddenly those two things are going to be kind of married forever. You're just always going to think about LL Cool J and Spider-Man in a band together. Maybe that's just me. But, so I try to put that kind of element in my comics now. I try to like just merge them in really funny, unexpected ways and just kind of have fun with it. As far as seeing it in comics, the sentiment I'm getting is that like it's hard to find it done well, or at least in a way that speaks to you, so you kind of have to go out there and make it yourself, which is hip hop. But like there was this one indie comic in the 90s, and I know you mentioned it, called Brother Man.
Yeah, I was just getting
Dictator.
into that. Yeah.
Ooh! I picked that up at a con in like 1990, like just a random, I didn't know anything about it, but it was just like, you could see something there that you didn't see in comics, and it was another one of those like, oh, you can do that moments. Because I remember just opening it up, and Brother Man, Brother Man didn't even appear in the issue, he wasn't on the cover, but it was just like, it looked like, it had like this classic cartooning, but it had the fashion, like the bucket hats, it looked like if Will Eisner drew an EPMD video. It's like, what it felt like, and it just blew my mind, like it's just one of the, and it's the only one I ever found, but it's just sometimes you just find those random issues that just make such an impact in your life.
I mean, and the other thing too is it's such a volatile combination. Like, I mean, for your imagination.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that really it makes your imagination explode.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to me, I'm like, that's the thing is I'm like, why isn't there more? Like, I want to see more. You know, I mean, to me, it just seems like that fusion of hip hop and comics just seems like an untapped resource in terms of like imagination. You know, and storytelling.
Also, hip hop was way ahead of the curve. Like, you talk about LL, like me thinking about Run DMC, like comics. I mean, I'm also, you know, rather old. Comics weren't cool,
Yeah.
but rap was cool. And like, if they were reading Marvel, I was like, oh yeah, okay. You know, LL does it.
Yeah.
I can't rap, but I can read comics.
Yeah, you walked out of the music store showing off your bag, but I walked out of the comic shop in my books. But yeah.
I think that's something that's always been interesting about comics and hip hop is that it always gave minorities and the working class a voice, because most of the time, both like, you know, young rappers and young artists come from places where they have to do everything themselves, and that's interesting when it comes to like beatboxing and rapping, is that it really puts a new voice to media that gets across to the people. And I think that because of that, because it's really influenced by the working class and by minorities, it's often an underappreciated art. Like everyone's heard comics aren't real art, or rapping isn't really music. And I think that those things are really similar to each other.
Yeah, and even comics were largely started, I'd say there was a lot of the early cartoonists were all Jewish guys who couldn't get work at other publications because of discrimination. So there's also that connection too, of like, well, there's no place for us in this world, so we're gonna go create our own.
And there's also, I mean, there's also that visual aspect to a lot of the music too. I mean, you talk about Deltron 3030. I mean, that entire album is its own universe.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about most of Danny Oliver's records. Like, you get that first Gorillaz record, and it's like, there's that crazy animated band.
Yeah.
There's Dr. Octagon, which is a whole other, not entirely PG-rated story. But
and a lot of that goes back to Funkadelic and Parliament.
Oh,
They were doing like this, and they were doing comics. You get some of those albums, and I can't remember the artist's name.
Overton Lloyd.
Yeah, and like that stuff was amazing. But then the whole Mothership connection, and again, when you talk about the alter egos that were adopted within the world of hip hop, like those guys really also pioneered that. You know, George Clinton, Bootsy, and all that.
Yes.
so that's actually a really interesting thing. The Overton Lloyd comics, like the whole comic book insert in Funkadelic, and all of these, in the same way that you can trace that history of comics back before comic books, you can look at the history of hip hop and comics and say like, oh, well, it started before hip hop was technically a thing. You know, you had the graffiti, you had these pieces, you had the Funkadelic comic. And something I wanted to talk to you about is that you're working with, I mean, you're doing the Shaft comic,
Yeah.
which is, you know, a period piece by its nature. And you've managed to tell a story that captures a lot of those elements, but it's not, like it's a hip hop comic, but it predates hip hop in a lot of ways.
Well, you know, hip hop is a, you know, it's a culture and it's a community. It was both of those things before it became a commodity. And when you look at the world that hip hop came from, which was a world of poverty, a world of people that were disenfranchised and marginalized, like that, it has roots like going back more than decades, going back centuries. So it's easy. Well, I shouldn't say it's easy, but it's sort of a natural, very organic thing to do. If you're telling the story that's set within the Black community, set within the the backdrop of poverty, you're going to touch upon a lot of those things, and a lot of those things are universal. You know, like we look at last summer and all the violence that was going on. You know, that the police were perpetuating against, especially poor people of color. Like that wasn't new. It wasn't like all of a sudden it just started happening in 2014. Like that's been going on, you know, since the first slave catchers were out, like grabbing us up and you know, saying no. You know, but I was about to swear.
But there's this little warning on the back of my Was it daunting at all taking on Shaft, like dealing with this character and ethos that was, you know, influential certainly on hip hop culture, but also on comic book culture? I mean, Shaft and the blaxploitation movement certainly spawned an entire wave of comics in the 70s that still have reverberations today.
Well, yeah, it was daunting, but it wasn't. You know, you sort of get to that, like if you're training to be a fighter, you get to that point where you're like, okay, well, like I'm ready, and either I'm gonna knock this guy out or he's gonna knock me out. But I'm done shadow boxing, I'm done sparring, I'm done hitting the heavy bag, and that's sort of how I felt. It was like, I'm ready to get in the ring and either get knocked out or, you know, beat the hell out of somebody.
Are we all just playing LL Cool J? That's what I figured. Matt, since I haven't actually addressed anything in you guys, you did, first you did 12 Reasons to Die with Ghostface. That was successful, and you ended up co-writing 36 Seasons and putting together that whole comic packaging for the record.
Yeah.
Bringing back that sort of Overton Lloyd vibe of like having a vinyl record with like the giant comic spread inside, reaching out to a lot of phenomenal artists for both 12 Reasons and 36 Seasons. But in doing so, in both cases, you managed to first create Wu-Tang comics that didn't suck, which is a small accomplishment. And secondly, you managed to weave your way around most of the sort of cliched elements of hip hop that people bring into anything when they're trying to create a hip hop work. You know, they throw in some breakdancing, they throw in some guy rapping, they throw in like a bucket hat and like some terrible, terrible graffiti drawn by someone who's clearly never actually been in a city in their lives.
Yeah, it was, it's sort of a, for those who don't know, the 12 Reasons to Die is an album, is a Ghostface record that RZA put together. And RZA's a really sharp dude, and he recognizes that people don't really buy records anymore. And he wanted to do something that propelled the record out of iTunes, propelled it out of the need to just be a digital commodity that can easily be traded and whatever. And so he had the idea to do a comic that was a pack-in, and there's a story to the record, and he approached me to adapt the story into the comic, and the more we talked about it, the more we realized that it wouldn't really work as a pack-in. It was too big, and so it became a mini-series. But the story's interesting because it's set in the 1970s in Italy. so there's not gonna be a lot of breakdancing there. And you know, I sat with RZA and he said, you know, it's really important that you make this feel hip hop. Like Wu-Tang is hip hop, and you have to make it seem like it's of us. And I struggled with that a lot, and then I watched his movie, Man with Iron Fists, with him, and other than the fact that he's in it and there's some hip-hop music, it's a kung fu film. I mean, it just is a straight kung fu film, but it feels very hip-hop, and it's something that's very subtle and very hard to pinpoint, and that's really what we aimed for with the comic, was not the pandering obvious stuff, no graffiti logos and no any of that, and we wanted it to be an authentic, you know, Italian gangster story meets giallo horror kind of vibe. And there were little things that we did in it to try and make it, I wanted to feel very Wu-Tang, and that's why there's a ton of guest artists on it, because I wanted it to have the vibe of, you know, the early Wu-Tang records where, you know, ODB comes in and just does a verse, and then he's gone off the song, and you just like, you love that person, you rewind it and you listen to it again, and I was like, that is how I want people to look at Ryan Kelly's pages, or how I want people to look at, you know, whoever's pages. They're just a guest there for 3 pages, and you just study them, and they're just like a total change of speed and tempo and style and everything, and then it just flows right back into what it was. I'm not sure everyone got that. I'm not sure that it necessarily worked flawlessly, but there was a lot of sort of thought to being faithful to not just what hip hop is in a deeper level, but what Wu-Tang was.
And the structure, that's an interesting structural trick. Also, I mean, the thing is that you've touched on storytelling earlier. The storytelling aspect of hip hop, I guess Kenny, you mentioned it briefly. It's, you listen to a good story song, you listen to something by Cool G Rap, you listen to Slick Rick, you listen to like the great storytellers, you listen to Rakim, and they are not rapping about breakdancing.
Yeah.
Like, it might come in for a moment, but they are telling a story, and often they're telling that sort of like deep, gritty crime story that you managed to capture really well.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, on the 36 Seasons record, I came up with a concept and sort of pitched it to them. I mean, it's basically the Odyssey, but we don't have to talk about that.
So you didn't exactly come up with it.
I didn't come up with it. So some people about it. It was funny because at one point someone was like, oh, it's kind of like, what did they say? They were like, oh, it's kind of like maybe it's Fistful of Dollars. And I was like, well, it's kind of like 100 things. Like, it's the Odyssey. It's like the most known story, and everyone repeats it. And they're like, oh, can we rip that off? And I was like, everyone rips it off. But it's funny because I'm not credited as a co-writer on the record because there's music unions and I didn't write beats and I didn't write rhymes, but the breakdown of the story and the structure and all the songs is me. But it's a weird thing because going in and telling Ghost, like, oh, this is what it's about, and like sitting with him in the studio and being like, well, these are, you know, these notes. The man is, I would say, in the top 5 storytellers, easily in hip hop, I would say in all of music. Like, paints a picture better than almost anyone lyrically. So to sit there and be like, this is the story that we're trying to tell to him, made me feel very bizarre, but it's awesome because it's like I said, it's the Odyssey, but he made it his own. And like, I don't think people pick up on the fact that it's the Odyssey because it's the story of Ghost. He's in it. He imbibes it entirely, and it's his homecoming from being away for 9 years. And I think that's what it's about, is like, hip hop is about incorporating other elements and making them into their own thing, and comics is that as well. And like, working with Ghost, it was easy to just have a story that, like, I could give this story to anyone, and it could be a Johnny Cash record, it could be a Bruce Springsteen record, it could be any like narrative-driven musician, but Ghost made it his own, and it's very, I mean, it's a great hip-hop record, I think.
Turner and Ted, when I ran across you guys last year at WonderCon, I don't know, I mean, Warp Zone is sort of sci-fi, Bon Vode video game, genre mashing thing. Wally Fresh is a guy in Brooklyn with a spirit animal roommate. Yeah. Like, these are not, neither one of those capsule descriptions makes you say hip hop. And Emil, when I, today, I guess I walked by your booth yesterday and was like sort of scanning and came by again today and I was like, there's something in that, there was just sort of that indefinable element. There's like this bold, graphic, kinetic sensibility, and a certain energy that like spoke to me in that sort of hip hop vein. Like there's elements of the fashion and the animation crossover. But again, like they're not, it speaks to you as hip hop, but it's not contrived, hip hop.
I always look at it I look at it similar as a band making an album. Every time I make a book, I did a pitch with this guy Swifty Lane, who was the writer on the Archaea book Feeding Ground, and when we started working together, that was the way we approached it as like, this is, we're doing a book, but we're approaching it as like, this is like a band making just kind of like a one-off album, and in terms of the collaborative process. But that's how I approach the books now, and each of the storylines I do, I kind of look at it like the latest storyline I'm doing for Wally Fresh is called Back in the Day, and it's kind of like me doing a remix of Back to the Future, like whereas if like a hip hop artist might do a cover of My Favorite Things, John Coltrane, like this is my cover of that, but I'm like taking the elements and remixing it and giving it to the audience in a way that they haven't really seen it before, but also letting my characters kind of interact with the idea. And then for me, like the fun of it is taking my characters and then putting them in these situations and then letting the audience kind of see like, oh man, like what's gonna happen to Wally? Like when Wally runs up against this kind of obstacle, I know he's gonna act like this, or that's part of the fun is like seeing how they're gonna react to these different situations. So,
I think there's a certain amount of like, for me, in a way I'd say like almost like visual sampling, like almost like somebody like Cut Chemist or somebody who put together, a beat. Like that's how I'm thinking in terms of visually interpreting the story. So there's all these disparate elements sort of coming together that I think speak to me and sort of my experience. Like I said, like I've got characters that wear like Pumas and Adidas and whatever, because that's my shit. Sorry. That is my stuff. Sorry about that. But yeah, like there's a line in one of Cut Chemist's, I don't know if it's on Oza Motley's first album or like Jurassic 5, where he like mixes Led Zeppelin and Frank Sinatra over a breakbeat, and it works. And it's like, why does that work? I don't know.
Yeah.
It just does, I don't know, because it speaks to Cut Chemist, So I think all these disparate elements come together for me, in a way that I think is cool.
Yeah. Part of it too is also kind of discovering the references, like because there are those. When you're listening to an album, there are those references in there where you're like, oh man, that's in the cut. Like you ain't even supposed to know about that, But when you experience it, it creates an intimacy between you and the artist. And so, for me, that's another kind of element that I try to incorporate, where it's like, they're talking about things or doing things that hopefully speaks to the audience in a way that like it feels like these are people that they know.
Yeah, there's like another line on Hieroglyphic's second album where he says that his rhymes are stronger than Cyclops' Optic Nerve. It's like, yo, that's strong. That is strong. Like, you would need a Ruby Chord speaker to freaking run that back. That's for real.
Well, Dell and Hyro are like serious. They're on the Marvel Capcom mixtape. Dell has put out, he announced 3, but he only ever got around to putting out 2 West Coast Avengers mixtapes. In typical Dell fashion, Third one will come out someday.
Okay.
Maybe not. That notion of sampling and covering, though, is something that is also innate to both these cultures. Not just in the sense that, doing straight covers of songs and the fact that, superhero comics were still ripping on the stories from decades and decades ago, but also, again, like you walk through Artist Alley and it's people offering their own renditions of characters and stories that speak to them. That's a very innate thing. That was one of the things that grabbed me with your whole section there. I was like, I walk by and I'm like, oh, Cora. Anyway, And like I stopped, and like something that I recognized, something familiar, was what it took to draw me in initially. And then as I started looking, it was the individual artistry that sort of grabbed my attention and kept me there.
Yeah, well, I mean, anytime that someone's gonna make a piece, like even if even if 50 people drew a picture of Superman, none of them would come out the same. I think that's why even when you go down Artist Alley and you're seeing all this fan art, there is like originality to the fan art, and I think that sampling from music is the same in that sense. Because even if you sample from a song that was written like 50 years ago, it's still gonna be different than if someone else had sampled that same song. So I think that's where that draws its ties.
I put a sample. I'm thinking it's funny because we're talking about this and I realized like there's actually a sample in the new issue of Shaft, which comes out later this month, where I sampled Grandmaster Flash from Furious 5, where I took a verse from one of their songs and turned it into dialogue that's related to what's going on in the story, and it was just sort of like I want to see if anybody would catch it, so I'm not going to tell anybody what it is, but it's right there, and going back to like part of what always made the music aspect of hip hop interesting to me was the way, or especially the rhyming, was the way it incorporated both reality and fantasy, and it would take these it would mention real people or real things or sometimes pop culture things, and bring it all together in this package. And I didn't realize till just right now that like that's what I've been trying to do with this story. So like in Shaft number 4, there's a scene where he's walking down 125th Street in Harlem by the Apollo Theater, and in the marquee it says Etta James with special guest the Jackson 5. And everybody was like, I got all these messages from people, and they were like, wow, that would have been the coolest show. And I was like, no, that was a show. The first time the Jackson 5 played the Apollo Theater, they opened for Etta James. And so it was like I took this reality and placed it within my fantasy and brought it, and I'm trying to bring a lot of those elements together. And I didn't realize how much that's hip hop until just like sitting here thinking about it.
Yeah, that's certainly, I don't, for someone who was not there at the inception, often these elements are sort of distanced from their context until you hear someone like Pete Rock or Premier or some producer start layering them back together. I never would have, Etta James and Jackson 5 seem like they're over here and over there until either a producer puts them together or until you realize that was the bill at that show.
Yeah.
It's not these vastly different worlds.
I also think, like, in going back to something you said earlier about the idea of sampling and taking different things, comics is really funny because there are, the artists who do swipes or whatever, who are taking the shortcut and taking someone's pose or someone's art and sort of incorporating it into their stuff, which I personally don't really have a problem with, but I understand why people do. But it's funny to watch the language of artists and the way an artist comes in, and I assume, this is probably true of every culture, but it has always felt very much like sampling to me, that you can watch someone break out in comics and then watch their style like filter down through everybody. And like the big example for me now is like Sean Murphy. That like what Sean Murphy does, and Sean Murphy incorporates a lot of things, and you can point towards like, oh, Sean Murphy is, ripping off, or not ripping off, but is like influenced by this anime and this guy and this guy, and now just his stuff is like trickling down into so many people's work. And even on the writing front, it's true. Like what Brian Vaughan does in Saga, the way Saga is structured, every issue opens with like a splash page with a sort of non sequitur. And there are like quite a few books now that are doing that, and no one was doing that 3 years ago. That it's like consistent in every book, and that's how he opens every issue. And it's like they're sampling Brian Vaughan. That's maybe a polite way to say it, or maybe a mean way to say it, but they're sampling Vaughan.
Is that like when every rapper from New York started sounding like they were from Houston?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Susan, what about when Jim Lee left X-Men in '92, dude?
Yeah.
Like every freaking X book looked like a Jim Lee like kind of knockoff,
Yeah. Or when Liefeld left, and like there were 5 million Liefeld swipes. And I think there's a fine line between.
Thank God.
Yeah, there's a fine line between a swipe or a sample and a cover version. Like, there are people who can sample Life Elderly and get away with it, and there's people where it's Life Elderly karaoke, and it definitely crosses that line. It becomes that. It becomes that Puff Daddy.
Yeah.
Every breath you take instead of.
It's interesting to me because like I picked up Nemonade's Arch Android, and like you can directly hear the influences of like Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson. I mean, her voice to me sounds like Michael Jackson from the Jackson 5, but she manages to do it in such a way that makes it her own. And you just like, to me, I'm like, oh man, like it's like this 2-minute cut of this one song sounds like something off the Songs of the Key of Life. And then but then it'll change, and then like all of a sudden now you're in like Marvin Gaye, you know, or you're in Etta James, you know. But I mean, to me, that aspect of it is fascinating to me, and like I think it carries over into comic books where you're seeing stuff where like, because talking about Sean Murphy, or where it's like I'll see stuff of his where I'm like, oh man, that feels kind of like a Tomo, or that feels like what was it? I saw one of his work. It escapes me now, I'm sorry. But just seeing the kind of like different influences, but also incorporating it into his workflow and seeing how it changes and how it affects the story itself. You know?
There's something to be said too for the evolution of an idea. It's something like Luke Cage, the difference between when he dropped in the 70s to like when Bendis got a hold of him, dude, like Bendis on Cage, like that's he made the character really. He was a cool character before. Like there weren't a lot of black characters in the Marvel universe, you know, but he gave it so many cool shades and made him like a well-rounded character, you know, that I thought it's freaking awesome, you know. I don't know.
And he had to go somewhere after that '90s rebound.
So that's it's interesting because Bendis took a character that he liked and Sample took the bits and pieces that he liked and created something all new out of it, which is that's what hip hop is, right? Hip hop is taking the old, in some cases the discarded or no longer usable, and you know it's taking a can of spray paint and going to a wall in a condemned building and creating a piece of art, despite what the police or the district attorney's office might say.
Also, I mean, also that aspect of like, this is what you heard, but you didn't hear this, and this is what I hear every time I listen to it, you know?
Yeah.
Or this is what I see when I look at different things.
I mean, I'm not a creator, but I am a DJ, and something that I had to wrestle with initially is like, as a DJ, you listen to other DJs, and you sort of go through that period of like, but they've already played those songs. Can I play those same songs? Can I make them my own by like putting them in a different order? And what it comes down to is, eventually you find your voice.
Yeah.
Like you can play all the same songs as some other DJ, and it will end up sounding completely different because of the way that you play them. And that gets back to the fan art thing. Like there is that individual voice in interpreting these characters and situations that really is astounding.
I mean, you could take it even further and say, like, you know, you look at Coltrane's My Favorite Things. You know, that's something from The Sound of Music.
And it's interesting because I hate The Sound of Music and I hate that song, but that's my favorite Coltrane song.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, I mean, to me, that's part of the brilliance of it is he's like, here's something that everybody has heard, and he's like, I hear something different when I listen to it. You know, and he's able to take that sound and give it to the audience.
You know, I think I was talking to someone the other day, another writer, and he was very upset about something that I actually thought was kind of amazing and I hadn't really thought about, which is that Warren Ellis's Global Frequency, this sort of like amazing, bizarre sci-fi opus. There are 2 books coming out right now that are almost direct references to that book by other writers, but like James Tynan's Memetic is something from Global Frequency expanded. It's in one issue of Global Frequency, and Alishkot's Zero, the character is named after the character from Global Frequency. It is essentially the same character, and he doesn't have permission to do it, but he essentially just sampled Warren Ellis and did it. I think Warren did it better, but like.
Yeah, but Warren is also someone who built his career on sampling. I mean,
Yeah,
you get
exactly.
Nextwave, you get Planetary,
And
you
the-
get like Transnet.
Yeah, the writer I was talking to was like, oh, it's so crappy that these guys are just taking his idea, and I was like, I think that's beautiful. Like, that's something you can't do in TV. That's something film you can't do. But like, we're a small enough medium, and it's underground, and it's collaborative, and we can jam on ideas in a way, in the same way that like you can make a mixtape.
Yeah.
And like, I thought about Alish's book Zero, and it's like his book before that, Wild Children. I always had a problem with that book, and I have a different version of that book that I want to do, and I want to like put out my version and be like, this is a response, a response track to Alice. I don't want to make it a diss track. But.
So let's, being that both comics and hip hop also embody a lot of contradictions, I'm going to turn this on its head. So we're talking about doing comics that incorporate hip hop, that don't have, that don't incorporate the recognizable elements. Kenny, on the other hand, you're someone who's like Rhyme Travelers is full of hip hop references.
Too much hip hop. This is too much.
And I mean, the first time that I became aware of your work, and the first time probably many people became aware of your work, was not through comic sites. It's when OK Player blew up the superhero and hip hop mashup covers that you started posting. And I mean, that was, it was fan art. It was also mind blowing to see like, Redman's There Is a Dark Side done with Dark Side head instead of Redman.
Yeah.
I mean, that, and as a comic fan, in the same way that, as a kid listening to Run DMC or LL and being like, oh yeah, comics are cool. I see that on the OK Player boards and I'm like, really? These people are talking about this comic book mashup? What do they know about Darkseid?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was absolutely I didn't expect anybody to really get them. It felt very inside. It was like just at home drawing at night. I'm like, I just had my son. That's also kind of where Rhyme Travelers came from, because sharing the culture but not playing Waka Flocka for him. I'm just in a place where it's like a lot of stuff's happening, and I'm just kind of like. I should be asleep, but I'm up at night, kind of just stress drawing, and I'm trying to draw Thor, and I'm like hearing NWA come on shuffle, and so it becomes straight out of Asgard, Warriors 3, and I'm like, and then it just kind of, when you get like that idea, like no one had seen any of them yet, but 2 days later I had like 12 of these things, and it was just like I couldn't stop, and finally I put them up on Flickr, and I was like, I don't know who's gonna get this. But I'm just gonna put it out there. And yeah, it was crazy, but it seemed very comic booky to me. So I expected if anybody was gonna get it, it would be, because the most recognizable thing are the superheroes, I thought, but it was like the rap blogs.
You did do a riff on He's the DJ and the Rapper, which is pretty recognizable to everyone of my generation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to like mine the classics, personal classics, but as well as kind of, and just anything that had kind of iconic cover would be immediately, Midnight Marauders, or Back in Business, so, yeah, and it just, I don't know, it was crazy to see you get that kind of reaction. And it's where it's like having that at shows, and that's how I met Gustavo, who I collaborated with on Rhyme Travelers, and it was just neat. It was like this bat signal, and then other people who had the same overlapping interests.
And then last year you pulled off a similar trick with the Superhero House Party, which, if you have not seen, seek out the Superhero House Party. We featured them on Comics Alliance at some point. And they're also on your Tumblr. They're around. Yeah. It's a bunch of different superheroes and comic characters interpreting different great hip-hop dance crazes.
Yes, if you want to see Thor do the shmoney dance.
Or the Flash and the Running Man. That animated GIF, it still makes me giggle to think of it. Okay, so Kenny and Matt, you talked a little bit about your experience working with Ghostface. You've also done some work with Big Boy and other pretty decent stature artists. What's that experience like? Are they well versed in the vocabulary that you're dealing with, or do you have to like find ways to express what it is you're getting at?
No, they get it, absolutely. Even if it comes from a place of nostalgia, even if they're not like in the shops every Wednesday, but they get it. Like they're immersed. Like Big Boy, he's like a very cool, very weird, very smart dude. And thinks very visually, which I think you can see from the style of music. So, he got it right away. He was great to work with. We did a series of sort of single covers for remixes, and we did some sort of animations to go along with them. And he kind of just let us go crazy. I mean, it was UFOs and just all kinds of, I don't know. It was dope. It was cool because like I come from like I work in like music videos a lot where I hear a song, I read too many comics, so I'm like, oh, this beat really sounds like a giant like spacecraft. And they're like, yeah, we don't have money to do that. That's a bad idea. But for this was a project where I was able to illustrate, and it was like, oh, now I can do all the crazy stuff that I associate with these sounds. And we're working on stuff all the time. So.
Matt, did you come across any particular obstacles while dealing with Wu-Tang?
No, I mean, Ghost is pretty, he's an MC, and that's it. Like, that's what he does, and he just wants to be the best MC he can be, and, like, he wants to surround himself with people who he can trust to do their jobs. So he's pretty hands-off on, like, especially on the comic stuff, he was just, like, looked at it and was like, this is cool, and I was like, I think so, and he was like, cool. RZA, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. RZA is, a Renaissance man in the truest sense of the word. The first time I had to meet RZA, I met him in the studio at 3 a.m. in Williamsburg, and I walk into a room and there's 20 people in the room, and I was just like, who are all these people? And they're like taking me around, and he's doing interviews for NPR and like some film magazine, and like they just have to be there at 3 a.m. because that's when he's there. And then he is sitting there listening to tracks, and like the engineer, he's like, oh, you know what, move that beat back, half a second, and move the sample up 2 seconds, and raise the treble there. And the engineer's like, okay, and he was like, do it. And the engineer was like, yeah, I can get that to you tomorrow. And Riz was like, just get up. And it was great because it was all their Pro Tools setup was all on touchscreens, and he did it like it was Star Trek. Like he just was like moving shit, and while he's doing that, there are people with like iPads being like, does this look good for a film poster? And he's like, I don't want the text up top. And he's like moving elements around, and then like he'll just turn to me and I'll be like, what happens in the second issue? And I was like, oh, they kill a guy. And he was like, okay. And like the whole thing was just like this whirlwind of insanity, but he is a genius and he can do that. But he was very hands-on. Like I had to, when the first issue was done, I went to dinner with him and he was like, okay, we're gonna get, and he ordered food for us and we sat down. And then, this is kind of a terrible story, but, and he was like, okay, and the food comes and he starts eating, and then he was like, he's like, my hands are dirty. And I was like, yeah, and I'm like going to reach for my food. He's like, hold up the pages for me. And I was like, oh, I'm not eating now, I guess. And I held up every page and like walked him through it, and he would just be like, I don't like the coloring there. And it was like so precise, and it was intimidating and scary and really awesome. And at the end of it, it was great because when we finished, we sat and talked about like old Shang-Chi Marvel books for like 2 hours, like 70 Shang-Chi.
That's actually a really good point. Kung Fu was mentioned before, around the Iron Fists, but there's a huge influence on hip-hop from that whole. There's a huge unspoken Asian influence on hip-hop that largely goes overlooked in anime and fashion and other forms. But that sort of 70s Kung Fu, certainly the films, the Shang-Chi books, the Deadly Hands of Kung Fu black and white Marvel magazines, I probably shouldn't blow this up. But I live in New York and you cannot find those things, so I love going to WonderCon and other conventions because I can dig through and find Master of Kung Fu comics and Deadly Hands of Kung Fu magazines that I cannot find on the East Coast because they've all been bought by rappers.
Yeah, I have a whole run of Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, but there's 2 issues missing, and that's because I loaned them to Brian Bendis, and he misplaced them. And so, but he more than made it up to me, like, time and time again, so. And I'll be able to find them, but yeah, that was, and it was so funny because he was doing research this is years ago, and I was the only person who had the complete run of Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, because I'm that guy on the West Coast, in the Pacific Northwest anyway.
Yeah, there's plenty of them in New York.
Yeah.
If you ever want a complete run, like, I can give you a bunch of rappers' names, and if you can track them down.
Yeah, it's a drag too, because Master of Kung Fu, Marvel doesn't own the rights to Fu Manchu anymore. So like, the chances of us ever seeing reprints of that are slim to none, and it's just some great stuff.
But it's also a nice cyclical thing, as I've discovered. Like, if you can find them, the back issues don't go for that much.
No, you just got to be
Because like, they're not being reprinted, they're not in the public eye, and unless you are listening to this panel right now. Again, I think I just totally spoiled my own fun. They're pretty easy to track down. I've put together a mostly complete run of Master of Kung Fu, and most of Deadly Hands of Kung Fu by literally never paying more than 50 cents per issue.
We're all gonna meet at the dollar minimum.
Yeah, let me tell you where the best crate digging at WonderCon is. We are actually just about out of time, which is a shame. We could go on for hours, and we have in the past, certainly. Usually we leave here and end up in the hallway outside and then at the hotel bar, and we're still talking about hip hop and comics. So let's just go down the lines, starting on that end. Tell us where your table is, tell us what you have out, drop your URL or your Twitter or whatever. Tell people how to find your stuff.
Well, we're at, both my brother and I, we're at SP87, right? Yeah. And a small press, and you can find copies of Warp Zone and Wally Fresh. We have the graphic novel for the latest Wally Fresh and along with the latest issue. And then my Twitter handle is @wallyfresh.com, or sorry, @wallyfresh. And then my blog is wallyfresh.blogspot.com.
You can find my stuff. My Tumblr is hellotedward.tumblr.com. I also Twitter tlange @tlange4. Also Instagram @tlange. No, my Instagram is shit. I got too many handles. Sorry. My Instagram is hellotedward.
If you find one, you can probably find
Yeah. And then if you'd like to, I got some dudes, really awesome producers. Some kid of the Milky Way and Computer J to produce a soundtrack for Warp Zone online. So if you go to www.enterthewarpzone.com, you can hear the soundtrack and read along. Some excerpts are online, so check that out.
Cool. Kenny.
What's up? I'm in Artist Alley E34, and I'm on Twitter and Tumblr and stuff as Kenny Kyle.
Yeah, I'm in Artist Alley at I want to say 26.
A few spaces down from Kenny.
Yeah, when you see Rob Liefeld, he's gone too far. And
How many times have I heard that?
he's the end of my row. And yeah, I have a new book that just came out this last week called We Can Never Go Home, which isn't hip hop at all. It's about punk rock kids in the 80s who kill some people and go on the run. And I guess I just spoiled the end of the first issue, but and yeah, and I'm doing an X-Men story in Secret Wars Journal #1, which is going to be out in May. If you want to see any of the X-Men do really weird stuff, that's one of 100 places you can see them.
My table's over at BO3 in Artist Alley. You can find my stuff mostly on my Tumblr, emkonishi.tumblr.com.
You should hold up some of your books.
Oh, yeah. So like some of the stuff that I'm gonna sell, we were just talking about Asian American influences. I am Asian American, and so a lot of my work comes from both like Asian shape making, like kind of woodblock style, and then also like lion decorish, like a painting style. And yeah, you can also find me on Twitter at emkonishi, but that's mostly me posting pictures of my dog. Don't follow me.
Let's see, I'm in Artist Alley table A06. I'm not going to be here tomorrow, so if you want to come by, we're come by. I'm on Twitter, David Walker 1201. Shaft is still coming out through Dynamite. I've got a story in, I think it's Battle World. It's one of Marvel's event books this summer, which is Blade versus Howard the Duck. Yeah, and it like write everybody, tell everybody about it, because I've got a mini series that I'm trying to get Marvel to do. And then in July, the first issue of Cyborg from DC drops. I'm writing that for DC. So.
Fantastic. And I am Patrick Reed. You can find me at DJ Patrick A. Reed on Twitter, or Depth the Zine for Depth the Field magazine. I write for Comics Alliance and Depth the Field. I do hip hop and comics panels. We announced yesterday that I'm doing one at a festival in Portland, which will involve David. Portland, Oregon, last weekend in May, hip hop and comics with Kid and Play Mixmaster Mike, David Walker, as well as a Kid and Play 25th anniversary screening of House Party, a Mixmaster Mike headlining performance. You might want to plan a trip to Portland. And this has been Hip Hop and Comics Cultures Combining. Thanks so much to our panelists.